In January of 1808, the importation of slaves became illegal federally, but the internal slave
importation became the importation became illegal federally, but he's talking about
trade continued. The slaves became illegal federally, but the internal slave trade continued.
Internal.
In 1820,
put them on the market. You've seen all the movies. I have this beautiful slave, and he's working hard, he has good teeth and fine muscles. I give him, oh wow. Hello, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Johan, and I'm a typical Dutchman. And I often wonder, why is there such a big gap between the Europe and the United States in understanding each other? What is missing in either the education of the US or the education in Europe that makes this gap possible? And how can we close this gap? And to find out, I dive into the American history to find those instances that I think that there is the first signs of the misunderstanding between how we are in the Netherlands or Europe and how things are going in America. And today I'm going to do this by visiting again the Kings and Generals site, the Kings and Generals YouTube channel. I have seen already a couple of those videos, and those were good videos and explanations, and how slavery caused the American Civil War. Because until now, we had the 13 colonies becoming the 13 states, and those combined fought the British army and won and declared independence and built up a constitution with the 4 founding fathers, a constitution and the Bill of Rights. But what's next? Because there is a civil war, and how did this happen? So I want to know more about it, and that's what I'm going to see in this video. If you want to learn along with me, then like and subscribe. And now dive into, I already did subscribe and I like the video, so let's dive into the video itself.
the American Civil War was one of the bloodiest, complex, and arguably one of the most important wars in all of United States history. The face-off between the North and South would be a divine test for the young nation, and this war would shed the blood of hundreds of thousands of young men. But why did it happen? Without further ado, let's dive into the American Civil War. It's difficult to live our best online lives securely without a VPN, and the sponsor of this video, NordVPN, is indispensable for the modern internet user. And by clicking our link in the description or going to nordvpn.com/kingsandgenerals, you can protect your communications and personal data. NordVPN's 5,500 superfast servers, located in 60 countries, will allow you to change your IP to avoid regional restrictions. Trust us, being geo-locked is no fun, and with NordVPN, you'll be able to connect to get more content out of your streaming subscriptions. Also, it's important to keep our browsing info safe from the prying eyes of the ISPs, and NordVPN will do just that. You can use it even in countries where VPNs are banned. NordVPN never logs your data and protects your information in public spaces by using double
If you want to use
encryption.
VPN,
It works
then
on Windows,
go to
Linux,
there.
iOS, and
When you want to use, because I was shouting over, when you want to use NordVPN, go to their website or go to this channel and click on their link to have the fallback. You have to fallback the subscription you need, because I do not have it to. So.
and Android, and has 24/7 customer support and a 30-day money-back guarantee. And most impressively, you can get all that for $3.56 per month. So what are you waiting for? Support us, get a free month of premium VPN, and save 70% by going to nordvpn.com/kingsandgenerals or clicking the link in the description. Don't forget.
Yeah. Use their link, because I don't have that link.
To use the coupon code Kings as Generals. The divide started even before the United States had declared independence. During the American Revolution, two parties rivaled one another, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists believed in a strong central federal government, whereas the Democratic Republicans believed in strong state governments.
Wow. Looking at this, we got the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. And now we have Democrats and Republicans. So, which one of those is who in current U.S. states?
This political dispute was a roaring debate at the time of the American Revolution, along with slavery. Alexander Hamilton led the Federalists, and Thomas Jefferson led the Democratic Republicans. Hamilton, being from New York City, spent his days as a financier and then became the first Treasury President. Jefferson was from Virginia, a plantation owner who inherited hundreds of slaves from his ancestors but still condemned it. In the initial draft of the Declaration of Independence, where Jefferson addressed his grievances with King George III, he stated, "He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce."
Yeah, okay. Slavery. A hot topic always. My point of view is respect your fellow human and ask to help. Pay if he wants to help, or pay if he does it voluntarily, but never force them to help or to do work for you. So, yeah.
This passage, along with a few others condemning the practice of slavery, was omitted to appease the slave-owning colonists and to make sure this did not jeopardize the revolutionary cause. Jefferson later on addressed the situation they were in metaphorically to John Holmes on April 20th, 1820. "We have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation in the other." Along with slavery, deciding where the real power should lie in this new independent republic was the most important topic to decide on for the new country. The Founding Fathers knew of the storm ahead of them, and John Adams said in one of his letters, "There is nothing I dread so much as a division of the Republic into two great parties, each arranged under its leader, and concerning measures in opposition to each other. This, in my humble apprehension, is to be dreaded as the greatest political evil under our Constitution."
Yeah, he feared that there would be two parties opposite of each other, so severe that they would go to war to protect their beliefs in what they think is the right thing to do. Whew. It's nowadays still happening in the United States, where two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are arguing with each other and getting every piece of dirty laundry they can find and throw it to the other party and saying, "You, and so we are the good guys, and you, because of we are that you are the bad guys." Damn! Already at this point in the United Nations, in the United States, it was already because of slavery forming, and apparently did never go away, even after the Civil War.
After the American Revolution, several northern states took action to ban slavery outright, or gradually, including Vermont, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. These states all passed legislation to reduce, limit, or abolish slavery, and by 1860, the practice of slavery had vastly diminished in the North. Ironically enough,
but not in all 13 colonies, 13 states, where is slavery abandoned or at least diminished. I only count 3 out of 13. But the other one, the blue, would be less. Did he say this?
Slavery outright, or gradually, including Vermont, Pennsylvania, apprehension. After the American Revolution, several northern states took action to ban slavery outright, or
everything in blue. To ban slavery outright. The northern states, that's what we have later on, TV series that I know of, North and South.
Or gradually, including Vermont, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. These states all passed legislation to reduce, limit, or abolish slavery, and by 1860, the practice of slavery had vastly diminished in the North. Ironically enough, some southern states did take some action, including South Carolina. Thomas Jefferson wrote to the future governor of South Carolina, praising him for the state's actions on the banning of importation of slaves in 1787, so there was some sort of common ground at the time. Even though the importation continued to be banned, the South saw its slavery numbers explode over the next 75 years.
Oh, it's not the entire blue continent. This is the United States of America. And then we have the northern part, like Pennsylvania and up. I believe it's Northwest Territory. And then we have the southern part of the then even small part of the United States. So it did not happen later on, when we had about the 50 states or 30 or 25. It's early on in the history that this already happened.
This slave debate continued with the western expansion of the United States, particularly with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which prohibited slavery in any newly acquired territories that would then become states. When the Constitution was signed, slavery was permitted and slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person, so their
3/5 of a person? 3/5 of a person. Counted as a 3/5 as a person.
population would not affect their electoral votes as much as they would have done by counting them as a whole. In February of 1793, the Fugitive Slave Act was signed, making the federal government responsible for returning slaves to their owners. The citizens of the northern free states started to feel like they were contributing to the practice against their will. More legislation would increase tensions between the North and South.
Because in the Constitution, and I did not completely review the complete Bill of Rights, I only did the first and the Second Amendment, but in the Constitution, and I guess in the Bill of Rights, there was nothing put in there to end slavery, and that's why this conflict happens.
The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 expanded the United States even more, but the issue of slavery was ambiguous, allowing the practice to continue. In January of 1808, the importation of slaves became illegal federally, but the internal slave
importation became the importation became illegal federally, but he's talking about
trade continued. The slaves became illegal federally, but the internal slave trade continued.
Internal.
In 1820,
put them on the market. You've seen all the movies I have this beautiful slave, and he's working hard, he has good teeth and fine muscles. I give him, oh wow. Selling off
A controversial agreement was passed called the Missouri Compromise. This was signed by James Monroe into law, allowing Missouri to become a slave state as long as no other territory state above it geographically could become one. Maine was added to the United States as a free state, continuing the balance of northern free states and southern slave states. This showed the country that lines were being drawn legally between the North and South, basically forming two different countries.
Yeah. Legally. Because it's a difference of opinion about slaves.
At this time,
not slaves, another human being. And this guy, and in this case, another black human being. Because most of the slaves were imported from outside, mostly from Africa. So that's what we're talking about, yeah.
The cotton gin began to maximize industry in the South, creating the need for more slave labor. The North began to implement protective tariffs that would help the manufacturing business owners more by taxing the South for imported and exported foreign goods, and it was a direct hit on its economy. The South considered the tariff of 1824 and 1828 unconstitutional, citing Article 1, Section 8, claiming these taxes to be not uniformly beneficial to the entire country, but only the North.
Yeah, okay. Tariffs again.
This is the fundamental reason why the Southerners viewed this war as the Southern War for Independence, or the War of Northern Aggression. This tariff was looked at as a protection of American industry by the North, but it was at the expense of the agricultural Southerner, both plantation owners and the consumer alike. The consumer would pay a hidden tax to afford such goods, and the plantation owner would have to pay more for those imported goods and for the ability to export. This system enraged the South, and would escalate in what was called the Nullification Crisis during the Andrew Jackson administration. Although a Southerner from Tennessee, Jackson was in favor of these tariffs because he was one of the few presidents that paid off the national debt to the bank. This was one of his proudest accomplishments as president, and he viewed any rebellion against these tariffs as treason, and being the ex-general that he was, Jackson was eager to hang anyone who rebelled against the federal government.
Death sentence!
After the Tariff of 1832 was signed, the South Carolina legislators showed their first notable and official opposition to the federal government by adopting the Ordinance of Nullification, making these tariffs null and void in their state. On March 1, 1833, a new bill called the Compromise Tariff of 1833 was passed, reducing the tariff to somewhat sustainable levels for the South, but the nullification of federal law continued to be hotly debated. With the tariff situation at bay, the focus became the moral practice of slavery. Abolitionists were continually forming in the North, and the distinct northern and southern traits began to emerge. The North and the South were fundamentally different economically and culturally. The North relied heavily on manufactured goods and Wall Street, while the South relied on agriculture and farming. At the time of the Civil War, the North...
Yeah. So, because they had plantations, they need more manual labor than the North, who was industrialized, and in those days, I guess steam engines, etc., are not that dependent on manual labor, and they could do things done without slaves, cheap labor, and although they need people to work at the plantations, they could, and they pay them the way that they should have paid. So, but in the South, they need cheap labor, aka slaves, to sell their product at a reasonable price to anyone who needed those.
North looked at the South as lazy, immoral, and uncivilized. The South looked at the North as greedy, money-grabbing, and immoral people. At this time, a religious
lazy. Progressive, I would say.
revival was happening throughout the country, with different denominations interpreting their own views of the Bible, and the position of slavery was certainly at the center of the moral debate, with the Northerners looking at it as completely unjust, and the South justifying the act with their interpretation of the Bible. Slavery is obviously a touchy subject with high emotions attached to it. That is why it's important to look at the hard numbers. By 1860, according to the 1860 National Census and the Historical Statistics of the United States in 1970, there was a population total of 31,443,322 people, which included 3,953,762 slaves. In the South, there were a total of 12,240,293 people. Of these 12 million people, there were 393,397 slave owners, comprising 3%.
Slave owners, not slaves.
Of the population. Richer aristocratic white slave owners made up a majority of this 3%, and they did have lots of power in the respective legislatures. Although slavery was central to the Southern economy, the average white Southerner was poor.
Yeah, I get it. Essential because cheap labor. Yeah.
Although slavery was central to the Southern economy, the average white Southerner was poor and lived off the land and didn't own any slaves. Additionally, according to the 1860 census, the native nations of Choctaw, Cherokee, Creeks, and Chickasaw owned slaves. The Cherokee owned the most, with 2,504 slaves. Because
the Native Americans had slaves?
of this, it would be natural for them to fight for their own interests, whether it was preserving their sovereignty or their own practices of slavery, so most of these nations sided with the Confederacy, while others supported the Union. When the Mexican-American War was ended by the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States gained even more territory, fueling the debate of pro- and anti-slavery states. In 1850, another piece of legislation passed, called the Compromise of 1850, allowing California to be admitted as a free state. But the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was signed, making it necessary for state government officials to help the federal government turn in runaway slaves. This once again made the North feel responsible for helping the trade prosper in the South.
Yeah. By federal law, if you find a slave who has fled from the South to the North, you need to bring him back to the South. Otherwise, you are aiding and abetting in a criminal act.
In 1851, a notable book was written by an abolitionist named Harriet Beecher Stowe called Uncle Tom's Cabin. This book described the lives of slaves and changed the hearts of many about slavery if they were on the fence. This was a crucial turning point in the moral insight and revelation that everyday people had. Uncle Tom's Cabin would bring the issue of slavery to the front lines of politics, especially with the new state of Kansas that was at the center of this debate. The question lay in whether or not
if it's not talked about, if you keep it under the radar and nobody's talking about slavery, then and nobody knows how slaves are being treated and how they live, then what's the problem, eh?
this would become a slave or a free state. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was signed in 1854, creating these new states. But the fate of slavery in them would be decided by the voters themselves, known as popular sovereignty. Both sides would persuade people to move to Kansas to increase their votes. This resulted in two different factions and even legislatures. In March of 1855, a pro-slavery government was set up and recognized, while the anti-slavery Free Soilers Party set up their own legislature and outlawed slavery. Tensions rose incredibly and violence broke out on May 21, 1856. In Lawrence, Kansas, pro-slavery forces attacked an anti-slavery settlement. Ongoing violence would continue, led by John Brown with a retaliating attack at Potawatomi Creek on these pro-slavery forces. This skirmish would be the prelude to the Civil War emerging in the next few years and would be known as Bleeding Kansas.
Bleeding Kansas.
The next event that cemented this divide was the case of Dred Scott of 1857. Dred Scott was an enslaved black man looking for a path to citizenship for him and his family, only to be turned down by a majority Southern Democrat Supreme Court. This case would solidify the fact that no
Southern Democrats. We have Northern Democrats too. And the Northern Democrats were anti-slavery and the Southern Democrats are pro.
Democrat Supreme Court. This case would solidify the fact that no black man, free or slave, would be considered a citizen of the United States of America.
No black man would be considered. So the constitutional right of due process, what's now heavily discussed in the United States for any person inside the United States, was not at that point by the Supreme Court. Now, it was not formulated yet at that time, and the Supreme Court say, no, you are a black American, so you don't have any rights to become a United States citizen.
Free or slave would be considered a citizen of the United States of America. This would be pivotal in the view of the status of all black men in America. A year later, Abraham Lincoln emerged on the scene as a star in politics. Unlike most of the Southern politicians who belonged to the Democratic Party, Lincoln was a member of the New Republican Party, also called the Grand Old Party, which was formed in 1854 by the former members of the Whig Party, who
So that was the New Republicans, okay?
opposed the expansion of slavery in newly created states or territories. He was extremely vocal about his anti-slavery views, particularly in the expansion of it. In the Senate race for Illinois, Lincoln faced off against Stephen Douglas, losing the election but gaining national prominence. The Southerners began to see that if Lincoln could gain the office of president, a whole new strategy must be implemented. Although he did not want to see slavery expand, he was not necessarily looking to go to war over it, let alone emancipate those enslaved. About 1 year later, in October of 1859, John Brown was on the national scene again. Becoming one of the well-known abolitionists of the time due to his actions in Kansas, and also a friend of Frederick Douglass, a prominent and arguably the most notable black abolitionist, he formed a slave rebellion against the Army arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Frederick Douglass warned Brown that pacifism would be a more sensible point of action, but Brown did not listen. He led a rebellious attack on the federal forces, but ended up executed for it. John Brown's rebellion would be known to some as the first shot in the Civil War, but would be remembered by all. Douglass would say that John Brown started the war to end slavery. The tipping point for the South was the election of 1860, where all of the conflicts in the previous decades came to a head when Abraham Lincoln was elected 16th President of the United States. Lincoln was opposed to the expansion of slavery, as we covered before, but did not seek to eliminate slavery in the states where it was currently practiced. Lincoln felt as if he had no constitutional authority to do so, and he did not want to see it continue to expand into the new territories.
Yeah, it was prevention if the territories who already had slavery are allowed to have slaves, as long as in the new territories and in the new states adding to the United States, this practice would be outlawed.
The election of Abraham Lincoln on November 6, 1860, was seen as an act of aggression from the North by the South. Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in most of the slave states, so Southerners were outraged when Lincoln won 180 out of 303 Electoral College votes. Aside from his views on slavery, Lincoln favored tariffs as well, so the 1820s and the early 1830s had the potential to repeat itself economically. South Carolina held the first secession convention on December 17, 1860, and 3 days later seceded from the Union. On December 22nd, Lincoln wrote a letter to the soon-to-be Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, which stated, "Do the people of the South really entertain fears that Republican administration would, directly or indirectly, interfere with their slaves or with them about their slaves? If they do, I wish to assure you, as once a friend and still, I hope, not an enemy, that there is no cause for such fears. The South would be in no more danger in this respect than it was in the days of Washington. I suppose, however, this does not meet the case. You think slavery is right and ought to be extended, while we think it is wrong and ought to be restricted. That, I suppose, is the rub. It certainly is the only substantial difference between us."
Yeah. We are one, except we in the North are respect that there is respect for another human being, and in the South you still keep on using slaves, and that's a difference of opinion, a very great difference of opinion between the two of us. But no, keep on going. We will be friends for more.
That, I suppose, is the rub. It certainly is the only substantial difference between us. Still, the states continued to secede, and Mississippi joined South Carolina on the 9th of January, famously declaring, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. There was no choice left us but the submission to the mandates of abolition or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles had been subverted to work out our ruin." Florida followed on the 10th, Alabama on the 11th, Georgia on the 19th, Louisiana on the 26th, and Texas on the 1st of February. Within these few months, the Confederate States of America was formed.
The Confederate States of America. With the Confederate flag. I know, the cross.
All even before Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated officially as president. On February 8th and 9th, the Confederacy created their own government in Montgomery, Alabama, and appointed its president, Jefferson Davis. In the Constitution of the Confederate States of America, slavery was now protected under Article 4, Section 3. In all such territory, the institution of Negro slavery, as it now exists in the Confederate States, shall be recognized and protected by Congress and by the territorial government, and the inhabitants of the several Confederate states and territories shall have the right to take to such territory any slaves lawfully held by them in any of the states or territories of the Confederate States.
Wow. In their Constitution. Hard to swallow.
March 2nd, 1861, in his last days as president before Lincoln took power, James Buchanan signed into law the Morrill Tariff, doubling the taxes, particularly on the South, from 15% to 37%, with increases up to 47% in the next few years. This was the last straw for the South, as they started to organize with the approaching new tariff-friendly Union president on deck. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln would be inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States. In this speech, he once again declares his duties to preserve the Union and collect these duties or tariffs on the South by doing whatever is necessary if forced upon.
So we put tariffs on the South because they do not respect the human lives. They still use slavery to gain their profits. So they have to pay more if they want to sell those products made by slaves to the northern countries, to the northern states. That was the idea of this tariffs against the South. More or less, forcing them into leaving slaves and become a slave-free nation or slave-free state.
In conclusion, there were many complex issues that led to this conflict. The right of states to secede from the Union, slavery, imbalanced taxes, two differentiating cultures, and the enforcement of tariffs were all contributing causes of the American Civil War. The new Confederate government was created in direct defiance of the federal government because they believed the Union was acting against the Constitution. This tension would start to explode as the final tariff bill was passed and Lincoln was inaugurated. The Union would fight to preserve the United States of America and enforce these tariffs, while the Confederacy fought what was in their mind a Southern war for independence to defend their homeland in what they call the War of Northern Aggression.
Wow. What would have happened if this would not have been done? If either the northern states or the southern states did not go to war, but just accepted each other and say the northern states are the northern states of America and the southern states will be the southern states of America, like we have, you see it right here, we have Mexico and Canada. So now between we have Canada, the northern states of America, the southern states of America, and Mexico. So 4 nations instead of this nowadays 3. What would have happened if this war would just not have been a war and each other, both would respected each other as in, okay, you want to be independent, you can be independent, and we will draw the line here, the border. Don't come into our country and we won't violate your country. Both have their own both have their own constitution, their own Bill of Rights, and we can live happily for the next 200 years, 1800s, 200s, 150 years until the current day in 2025. But it did not go that way. It became a civil war because one would force their beliefs onto the other, either north to south or south to north. It's this forcing of these beliefs that led to the Civil War. Well, in the next video, I hope to see what happened during the Civil War and find more clarity in what did this do to the relationship with Europe and this great misunderstanding about each other's way of living. I hope you enjoyed the video together with me and you learned something together with me. So like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.